Well, you know, I was raised in a theosophical family, and one of the first things that I learned about theosophists is that they like to have meetings. They like to greet each other, almost always with hugs, as you New Zealanders are doing. And they like to eat. So, we're right on target with all theosophists from around the globe. So, before we start, I've been pondering something, and I wanted to just share it with you. It's a rhetorical question. Have you ever wondered why you were born at this particular time and place in history? If we subscribe to the tenets of theosophy, then surely there is a reason that we are here today. Each of us has a role to play during this tumultuous time. I don't know what it is, but we each have one. It must have something to do with serving humanity, because humanity needs us now as much as it ever has. Just something to contemplate. So, over the last few days, well, it's only been yesterday, but there was so much. It felt like a week's worth just in the day. We've talked about so much, and all of it just amazingly dovetails beautifully with the topics of love and service to humanity. According to Jack Kornfield, the Dalai Lama regularly recites the Bodhisattva vows based on the words of Shantideva, a 6th century sage. They are, may I be a guard for those who need protection, a guide for those on the path, a boat, a raft, a bridge for those who wish to cross the flood. May I be a lamp in the darkness, a resting place for the weary, a healing medicine for all who are sick, a vase of plenty, a tree of miracles. And for the boundless multitudes of living beings, may I bring sustenance and awakening, enduring like the earth and sky until all beings are freed from sorrow and all are awakened. Touches my heart. This is service to humanity, the Bodhisattva path. The real question is, how do we, as human beings who frequently struggle just to make it through the day, how do we become all of these things for others? Well, as we've heard from several speakers, it's important that we work on spiritual self-transformation. It also seems important that we focus on practical external actions. The interesting component here is that the two, self-transformation and external practical actions, are actually interwoven. This means that our actions really depend upon our self-transformation, and our transformation impacts the actions that we choose. As theosophists, we have spent hours upon hours listening to talks, participating in discussions, and studying literature, much of it which tells us we need to work on spiritual self-transformation. However, all of these very cognitive components, while valuable, must be interwoven with practical action. In fact, the Mahatmas enjoin us to make the ageless wisdom practical. In an article published by Blavatsky in 1888 in the journal Lucifer, written by, quote, a master of wisdom, we read, Theosophy should not represent merely a collection of moral verities, a bundle of metaphysical ethics epitomized in theoretical dissertations. Theosophy must be made practical, and it has therefore to be disencumbered of useless digressions in the sense of desultory orations and fine talk. Let every theosophist only do his duty. So what is our duty? Practical action as we work to transform ourselves spiritually, and practical action in relating to others. It is the internal journey of spiritual self-transformation which is our daily work. Each and every day, hour, and minute, we hopefully are engaging in self-observation. Why? In order to make changes, we need to know what needs to be changed before we can begin to change it. Our personalities, I'm sure yours, and I definitely know mine, provides us with numerous opportunities for self-observation and changes to be made. We are conditioned by the world in which we live, and this conditioning is deeply ingrained in us. It was mentioned yesterday, I believe, by Carol. We don't even realize this conditioning frequently. As Krishnamurti says in The Urgency of Change, we are conditioned physically, nervously, mentally by the climate in which we live and the food we eat, by the culture in which we live, by the whole of our social, religious, and economic environment, by our experience, by education, and by family pressures and influences. All these are the factors which condition us. Our conscious and unconscious responses to all the challenges of our environment, intellectual, emotional, outward and inward, all these are the action of conditioning. Language is conditioning. All thought is the action, the response of conditioning. Recognizing our conditioning is no small feat. I think you know this lady, Diana Dunningham-Chapotin, dear friend, wise woman. She tells us that working on our own spiritual barriers, another word I think for conditioning, is, quote, perhaps the bravest and most radical step we can take. She says that what we must be willing to face our own doubts, needs, and resistances, the inner barriers to the expression of our caring instincts. We need to own up to feelings of guilt, anxiety, discomfort, disappointment, and vulnerability. We also have to be willing to look for the deeper fears behind these spontaneous reactions. Fears of loss of control, of being overwhelmed, of having our heart broken, and ultimately of extinction. She says, this is the core of theosophical service and the surest way to open the heart to its potential of limitless giving. Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Diana. Working on these issues is perhaps the bravest step we can take, and it can be quite radical for some. Very few of us are willing to look at these shadow aspects of ourselves. And heaven forbid that we allow others to see our less than perfect selves. Finding the courage to look at ourselves clearly and objectively is an essential component of our work. Those aspects that many, if not all, of us keep hidden must be revealed, at least to ourselves, so that we can make the necessary changes. As we begin to see ourselves more clearly, we also begin to see others more clearly. Our understanding and compassion for them increases. Thus, our interactions with others begins to change due to our own self-understanding. Here is an example of a theosophist whose understanding and compassion is both inspirational and thought-provoking. Marie Poots lived at Crotona in Southern California in the United States in the early to mid part of the 20th century. I never knew her, only heard her referred to as Miss Poots. She was an amazing woman and theosophist. Joy Mills talks about her in the book Inner and Outer Transformation. Miss Poots discussed the question of right action. She said the difference was not between right action and wrong action, but rather between love and not love. She describes love as actions that awaken the immortal spirit within others. Isn't that what we want for the world? To find the beauty of their true selves? She described not love as any action that helps to obscure the interior light of another. So if we look at any action we may take as, is this action love or not love? We are then acting in every moment in recognition of the divinity in all, taking practical action based on the teachings of the ageless wisdom. Joy also tells us there are many lonely people in the world. There are so many who have suffered loss of one kind or another. And above all, there are those who are hungry for understanding, for truth, for the wisdom which the theosophical worldview has to offer. We may not have all the answers, and indeed, no one of us can have all the answers. But we can speak from the heart. And if we cannot speak, we can reach out with a smile. That action will always be right, which flows from love, from the heart. We live in a manifested world that is fraught with divisiveness. It hurts our hearts to see the inhumanity inflicted upon others. I will say even between brothers and sisters in the Theosophical Society. It is easy to get caught up in blaming others or becoming angry with the one who is inflicting suffering. William Q. Judge, one of the co-founders of the Theosophical Society, in his article, How Should We Treat Others?, tells us, the subject relates to our conduct toward and treatment of our fellows, including in that term all people with whom we have any dealings. No particular mode of treatment is given by theosophy. Theosophy doesn't tell us how to act, does it? Just gives us the overarching ways, overarching ethic. It simply lays down the law that governs us in all our acts and declares the consequences of those acts. It is for us to follow the line of action which shall result first in harmony, now and forever, and second, in the reduction of the general sum of hatred and opposition in thought or act, which now darkens the world. Judge wrote this over 100 years ago. He continues saying, the Master K.H., once writing to Mr. Sinnett in the Occult World, the newspaper, and speaking for his whole order and not for himself only, distinctly wrote that the man who goes to denounce a criminal or an offender works not with nature and harmony, but against both, and that such act tends to destruction instead of construction. Whether the act be large or small, whether it be the denunciation of a criminal or only your own insistence on rules or laws or rights, does not alter the matter or take it out of the rule laid down by that adept. For the only difference between the acts mentioned is a difference of degree alone. The act is the same in kind as the violent denunciation of a criminal. Either this adept was right or wrong. If wrong, why do we follow the philosophy laid down by him and his messenger and concurred in by all the sages and teachers of the past? If right, why this swimming in an adverse current, as he said himself? Why this attempt to show that we can set aside karma and act as we please without consequences following us to the end of time? I know not. I prefer to follow the adept, and especially so when I see that what he says is in line with facts in nature and is a certain conclusion from the system of philosophy I have found in Theosophy. Mr. Judge certainly gives us something to consider as we think about the reactions we have to the circumstances occurring in our world today. My understanding, okay, because I don't know exactly what Judge was trying to say, but my understanding as I read it is that, I'll give an example. If I get upset about what's happening in the Middle East right now, and I start blaming a particular person or a particular country or a particular group for their actions, then I am committing, in essence, the same act. Yeah. Maybe not to the same degree, certainly, but it still carries with it a form of karma. I'm adding to the destruction rather than construction. Well, you know, when they wrote in that Victorian language, could they put more words in those sentences? Going back to an article by Diana, we discover some interesting comments about serving others in a very practical manner. Diana cites the article in The Service of Life by Rachel Naomi Remen, published in the spring 1996 issue of Noetic Sciences Review. And I'll share that with you if you would like it. Well, Diana cites this article by Rachel Naomi Remen, and it distinguishes between fixing, helping, and serving. Because we want to help other people, don't we? We want to fix things for them. We want to serve humanity. Well, fixing is a form of judgment. To fix a person is to see them as broken rather than inherently whole and perfect. Helping is based on inequality. To help is to use one's own strength in place of the lesser strength of those helped, and so diminishes their self-esteem and incurs a debt. Serving is mutual. We don't serve with our strength. We serve with ourselves. Service rests on the basic premise that the nature of life is sacred. When we help, we see life as weak. When we fix, we see life as broken. When we serve, we see life as whole. I had never thought about it like this. We often use those words interchangeably, especially the help, yet their meanings have significant differences. Our goal is to serve, but it is quite easy to fall into fixing or helping. We want so much for the other person not to struggle or suffer. It's also important to consider the thoughts and feelings we're sending out unconsciously to another individual if we want to fix or help them. Perceiving others as whole, sufficient, strong, capable, and so on is an important element in interacting with others. We know that it is true that they are all of these things. All of us are whole. We are rays of the divine. All of us. Even when we are struggling with a difficulty or an obstacle. Do we perceive a mountain climber as less when he or she struggles to surmount a difficult peak? Or a runner who stumbles in his or her race? Of course not. We actually recognize their strength. We know they are capable of surmounting the difficulty with which they are faced. Therefore, it is important that as we seek to serve others, we see them as they are, sparks of the divine, just like us, whose higher self has placed obstacles on the path to facilitate growth and strength. Once we know that fixing or helping is not part of the path we follow, we must look to ourselves and our perceptions of the situation to make sure we are serving, walking with our brother or sister for a way on their path. There is an aspect of serving humanity that is rarely discussed in theosophical circles. Yet, from my perspective, it is an important one: self-compassion. We are on a very difficult journey, as we know, both from our study. I was wondering why most people didn't get up and run out of this room the other night when I was quoting from Voice of the Silence about our path of woe. And we also know it from our own lives. It is not easy. This work requires that we are consistently self-aware and objectively self-observant, attempting to become aware of every thought, word, feeling, and action. We try not to judge others and to have unconditional love for all. But at times, we judge ourselves very harshly, and our self-love is often very conditional. I'm reminded of that joke: I love humanity. It's my neighbor I don't like. In my case, that's not true. My sister is my neighbor. I do like her. Don't want her to misunderstand. Here we might say, I love humanity. It's myself I don't like very much. Authenticity has several meanings, but for our discussion, we can define it as being honest, real, genuine. A person who is authentic is true to himself or herself, congruent in their beliefs and their actions. There's no pretending or hiding in order to make others or ourselves feel more comfortable. Authentic individuals take responsibility for their mistakes, recognizing that they are not perfect and don't pretend to be. In other words, with a person who is authentic, what you see is what you get. Let me be clear here. This does not mean that a person who is authentic bears everything. They don't tell all. They just are who they are. Well, you may wonder what authenticity has to do with self-compassion. The words of Brené Brown clarify this for us. And if you're not familiar with Brené Brown, I strongly encourage you to check her out. She's amazing. She writes, "Authenticity is the daily practice of letting go who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are. Choosing authenticity means cultivating the courage to be imperfect, to set boundaries, and to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Exercising the compassion that comes from knowing that we are all made of strength and struggle, and nurturing the connection and sense of belonging that can only happen when we believe that we are enough." When we wear a mask, pretending to be something we are not being compassionate with ourselves. In many respects, we wear a mask when we feel that we aren't enough. As Brené Brown says, instead of being compassionate with ourselves, we're judging ourselves harshly. It takes a great deal of courage to be authentic, to let go of the mask, to let go of the way we think we are supposed to be. When we allow ourselves to be seen without any pretenses, without a mask, we act in accordance with the physical human experience summed up by Brown's comment that we are all made of strength and struggle. This recognition and ensuing action is part of our spiritual journey, isn't it? Thich Nhat Hanh says, "To be beautiful means to be yourself." You don't need to be accepted by others. You need to accept yourself. Therefore, the first step in self-compassion and authenticity is self-acceptance. Our life in the physical world has often been referred to as a classroom. If we use this analogy, we can consider the fact that every student in the classroom is unique. Each student learns differently and at a different pace. When we look at the work that happens in the classroom, we realize that no one makes 100% on every test or every assignment. There is no perfection. As adults, looking at students in a classroom, do we get upset because someone has failed a test or done poorly on an assignment? Hopefully not. Hopefully, we realize that the student failed or did poorly because he or she has not yet grasped the material and needs additional work in a particular area. Needing additional work in a particular area does not make a student less valuable or important. Many years ago, seems like lifetimes, I was a high school teacher. And because I was probably a new teacher, that's really probably the real reason, they gave me a special class. And it was a class of students who were at risk of dropping out of high school. And the teachers who'd been around longer all said, I don't want to teach those kids. So they gave it to me. So I not only had a class with those students, but I also taught them English, which is quite interesting. Well, one of the students who was in both of those classes with me, he acted out all of the time. His behavior was just unacceptable. In school, it was unacceptable in class. He would lay his head down on the desk and go to sleep. He refused to read when we would read aloud. I would assign them a paragraph to write or 3 paragraphs to write, and he just wouldn't do it. So finally, because I was a young teacher, it was finally, I took him outside and said, what is going on with you? He could neither read nor write. He was in high school, and he couldn't do either. And he was so embarrassed and so ashamed that he covered that up by refusing to do the work because he couldn't, but he didn't want his peers to know. So I began to work with him quietly, individually. First on one sentence. First on improving his reading. It took a while. He wasn't always happy with me. It didn't proceed easily by any means. But eventually, he could write a 3-sentence paragraph. So how do we feel about that young man? Are we upset with him? Mad at him because he couldn't read or write? No, of course not. Our hearts just go out to him. We have compassion and understanding for the behaviors that he had. And we cheer for him when he eventually writes that 3-sentence paragraph. The end of that story is that he did eventually graduate from high school. Not great grades, but he did eventually graduate. And I actually saw him in the local grocery store a couple of months ago. And he recognized me. I didn't recognize him because he was a grown man. This was, 30 years ago. And he's doing well, and he has a family, and he has a job, and he's successful in his own right, as will all of humanity be one day. Can we see ourselves like this? That we are as important and as valuable as every other being, even when we make mistakes, when we fail a test or do poorly on an assignment, so to speak. Self-compassion is accepting ourselves as imperfect beings who are doing their best to walk the spiritual path. Being honest with ourselves and not trying to appear perfect to others is part of being compassionate with ourselves. Back to Brené Brown, who says, to be authentic, we must cultivate the courage to be imperfect and vulnerable. We have to believe that we are fundamentally worthy of love and acceptance, just as we are. We are talking here about the personality. Often in our theosophical discussions, we are focused on the higher aspect of our being, ignoring the personality and perceiving it as something to be controlled and dismissed. But we have a personality for a reason. Realizing that it is fundamentally worthy of love and acceptance is part of our work on the spiritual path, part of our work in the Kama Manasic field of consciousness. Yes, the personality is temporary, but it is our home in this lifetime. It is also the means of our spiritual growth. Our brain can be an inner critic, saying things to us that diminish our sense of self-worth, that tell us we're not lovable, not worthy. These thoughts, as we know, are conditioned from the world in which we live. For instance, if we grew up in a household that tended to be critical, we bring those critical thoughts with us into adulthood most of the time. We see ourselves and the world around us through the lens of, I'm not enough, I should, I ought. The emotions jump into this debilitating depth of these thoughts and swirl. So we put on a mask so that others don't see our unworthiness, our unlovableness. From our studies, we know that the statements of the inner critic and the accompanying feelings are in direct opposition to the reality, with a capital R, of our situation. We are sparks of the divine, manifested in physical form and participating in a physical classroom to learn. When we are kind to ourselves, then we are kind to all beings. Many of us frequently act from the heart. Many of us are already engaged in service, whether as a career or as volunteers. Many theosophists are innately drawn to social service work in some form or other, while others spend time working for food banks or homeless shelters or some other place. Some work to provide support for those impacted by crisis, trauma, or catastrophes. Others work for social justice and equality in the world. And the list goes on and on. It is important, however, that we remain aware that our personalities, because they are our personalities and are imperfect, can easily get caught up in our efforts to serve. As always, self-observation of our motives, especially deeply hidden ones, is essential. Mabel Collins, in her essay on karma, at the end of the book, Light on the Path, reminds us of this, saying, "Desire to sow no seed for your own harvesting. Desire only to sow that seed, the fruit of which shall feed the world. You are part of the world. In giving it food, you feed yourself. Yet even in this thought, there lurks a great danger, which starts forward and faces the disciple who has for long thought himself working for good, while in his inmost soul he had perceived only evil. That is, he has thought himself to be intending great benefit to the world, while all the time he has unconsciously embraced the thought of karma, and the great benefit he works for is for himself." What discernment that takes, doesn't it? Once again, relentless self-awareness and objective self-observation are an important component of our journey. Well, we have talked about so much in this short period of time. I hope it didn't feel like a long time. No theosophical talk would be complete without some discussion about the importance of our inner spiritual self-transformation. But we also explored the need for this internal transformation to be interwoven with practical action. As the Mahatma said in the article from Lucifer, theosophy must be made practical. We looked at the conditioning that occurs in this manifested world and how it impacts us. We talked about Miss Poots and her perspective of action being based on either love, actions that awaken the immortal spirit within others, or not love, any action that helps to obscure the interior light of another. Joy Mills comments about the actions that flow from the heart always being right actions. We looked a bit at co-founder of the TSWQ Judge, his perspective on how we should treat others, including the perspective that denouncing another, even a criminal, is violent in its own right. We examined the differences between fixing, helping, and serving, recognizing that serving is mutual, and perceiving that it rests on the basic premise that the nature of life is sacred and whole. We also looked at the value of self-compassion as we walk this most difficult path. From our studies, we know that the statements of the inner critic and the accompanying feelings are in direct opposition to the reality of our situation. That we are sparks of the divine, manifested in physical form, and participating in a classroom in order to learn. And we received a warning from Mabel Collins about the motivation for our actions. The path of the soul's journey is an interweaving of both internal self-transformation and external practical actions. Both, if based on theosophical teachings, help us to serve humanity, to walk the Bodhisattva path. And as a reminder, why do we walk this difficult path? Because we have heard the call from the voice of the silence. And I'm not referring to the book here, but to that inner voice, the voice of the soul that reverberates inside of us, if we listen carefully enough. We have heard the call. Can there be bliss when all that lives must suffer? Shalt thou be saved and hear the whole world cry? No, we answer. We hear those cries and will work to alleviate suffering. We will walk the path of the Bodhisattva through both spiritual self-transformation and external practical actions based on love for humanity. Thank you.
Oh, that was amazing, wasn't it? Yeah, absolutely terrific, Barbara. Covered so much, from being authentic to how we treat each other, walking the Bodhisattva path. There's so many lessons and the lookings at ourselves and how we behave and what we're trying to do for our own self-transformation. And I think one of the key messages for me, I'm sure all of you, is about being authentic and actually treating ourselves well, because we often are quite harsh on ourselves, aren't we?